If you're married, you took an oath, right? For better or worse, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. But what does that oath really look like when it comes to the really big challenges? Well, many of my clients come face to face with that challenge later in life. More specifically, when one spouse's health declines to the point that they can no longer live at home. And maybe the other spouse just doesn't have the capacity or the emotional or physical strength to continue to care for the other. Happens all the time, right? Nursing home care is often part of the equation, even if it's just for one spouse. So, what do you do when one spouse may need nursing home care and the other is still able to go on living at home? Like I said, this is one of the biggest challenges that a married couple may face later in life, and it's happening more and more. And there are a couple reasons, I'll get to that in a minute, but the scenario when a married couple is looking at nursing home care for one but not the other, really is gut wrenching because it involves not only a separation of those two, sometimes for the first time or for the first time in 50, 60 years. It also represents a huge financial challenge, money, right? How are you going to pay for this long term care for the spouse in a nursing home? Where's that money going to come from? What happens to the spouse at home? Have you planned for this challenge? Well, I can tell you, most people, the answer to that is no. What about help? Can other family members help with the cost? Probably not, right? And if you've got assets, what do you keep and what gets spent for that nursing home care? And like I said, what does it mean for the financial safety, security, everything, right? For the spouse who remains at home alone? Well, for a lot of folks, this is one of the greatest challenges that they may have faced in their marriage. What happens next? Can we get help, right? How? And is there help for one and not the other? Well, these kind of questions come up all the time with people that I'm meeting with, and it's an enormous challenge. The average nursing home stay can be upwards of 5 years. Right now the cost can be over $10,000 a month. You do the math, right? This can obviously wipe out any savings fairly quickly. So does it doom the other spouse to following in the same path? What what would you do? What would you do, right? Do you have the resources to pay for this type of care? How long can you pay for it? Like I said, can you get help? Do you know where to get that help? Do you know what it involves? Well, the government offers some benefits, but it comes with strings attached. Namely, you have to be eligible, right? Eligible for that assistance. And if you are, your family is going to face recovery for any benefits that are paid out after you pass away. Do you know what that recovery looks like? Chances are you've probably heard some things, but do you know if that's really reliable? I hear a lot of stuff that's just not plain true, it's just bogus. And that can be costly too. This is tough stuff. I thought today we were going to try to tackle some of this. So, welcome back. Of course, this is Boomer time. We talk about all issues involving aging. I want you to be better aware, better prepared. I'm your host, Nancy Cogar. And one of the scariest topics we're diving into today is a topic that touches so many families. It's often an unknown, really, until you come into a situation where you're facing the challenge of paying for long term care. But before that, it often gets ignored until a crisis hits. Long term care and what happens when one spouse enters a nursing home and the other stays home. Well, it's my hope that you'll walk away from this episode with some good, reliable information that you can count on. And maybe, just maybe, it will inspire a few conversations as to options and planning, right? And if you haven't done it already, take some steps to put a plan in place for your sunset years. Trust me, you will be glad you did. I'll be back with all kinds of information you don't want to miss right after this. Well, we are talking the challenges that come with considering nursing home care, finding quality care, paying for it, and sustaining it, right? Especially if it involves one spouse that's going into the nursing home and the other plans to remain at home. So what do you do if you're in that scenario? Now now it's not just about the rules and applying. It's about love, it's about commitment, it's about loss, it's about dignity, right? And it's about making some of the hardest choices that a family may ever face. I want to unpack that legal structure, the emotional toll, and the financial risks, plus that looming shadow of Medicaid estate recovery. So I want you to grab a cup of coffee, and if you're driving, just settle in. I want to talk about some of these things that you need to know to protect yourself, your spouse, and your future. Let's start with the basics. So there's just so much plain old confusion about Medicare versus Medicaid. Do you know what the difference is? A lot of people don't. So I thought this was an important starting point today. So, first, when you turn 65, right, currently, Medicare is the federal program in which you enroll for health care thereafter. And there are all kinds of options, so many, and I'm not going to get into that today, but that's why they call it the alphabet, right? You often have to purchase supplements for Medicare to pay for prescriptions, and Medicare is not the same as Medicaid, okay? I hear people using those two terms simultaneously, and there's huge differences. So it's important to take note. So if you have Medicare, which most people over 65 do, this will generally cover hospitalizations and routine general wellness care with some exceptions, of course, and I'm not going to get into all that today. I don't want you to get all mad at me and tell me that something wasn't covered. It's complicated, but I want to focus on the complicated task I have here today. I wanted to talk about if you're on Medicare and you're admitted to the hospital, well, this coverage, Medicare, right, will generally cover your care for up to 100 days from that initial hospitalization. So, with some exceptions, right? So, once you hit that 100-day marker, then you're going to find yourself paying for either a larger portion or all of your care thereafter. That is because Medicare is designed primarily to get you as well as you reasonably can be so you can get up out of the hospital bed and go home. But what if you can't go home? What if you need long term care, nursing home care? Well, Medicare doesn't cover that. And you've got two options at that point: pay it yourself, private pay, or apply for Medicaid. And here it's known as TennCare. You have to be eligible for Medicaid in order to receive it. And let me say that again, okay? So Medicare does not cover long-term nursing home stays beyond a short rehab period in skilled care. This is one of the biggest misconceptions I see. So key point: how do you know whether you're eligible for assistance through Medicaid? Bottom line is income. In many states, an individual must have income below a monthly threshold. So it depends on the state, but currently in Tennessee, it's just under $3,000 a month, 2,900. And so what's income, right? Includes Social Security, veterans benefits, pension payments, RMDs, and all of that. So what's the next point? Assets. A single person typically, in order to be eligible, cannot have more than $2,000 in countable assets. Well, that doesn't go very far, right? And then medical need, of course. You have to require that level of care. So now things get trickier when a married couple is involved, especially when one spouse needs care, nursing home care, and the other doesn't and remains at home. So the spouse at home is known as a community spouse. And we're going to talk more about that. So the community spouse, and really, how do you protect that person left at home? Here's a scenario for you, okay? A husband has Alzheimer's and has declined to the point that he needs nursing home care. His wife, she's 74. She still lives at home. She's healthy, but quite frankly, terrified, right? About losing him, losing their home, becoming destitute. It's not unusual. And it makes sense, right? So she is faced with not only potentially losing her spouse, but losing everything that they built together over the years. What's going to happen to her? Well, the law does have some protections for the spouse that's at home. And I wanted to talk about a couple of those. So the first one would be a resource allowance. That's what it's called. So that the spouse at home can typically keep, well, I say this, there's exceptions, right? Keep about half of the couple's assets, countable assets. But there's a cap on that. And in 2025, that cap here is about $150,000. Each state's different, but you can have a minimum and then a maximum. It may be that the spouse at home could keep all her own income and, assets that belong specifically to her, along with some of her spouse's money to ensure that she doesn't fall behind or below that monthly needs allowance. There are also, and I don't want to confuse you here, but different assets are treated differently. So the homestead, your home, is usually protected. It's exempt, not countable, up to a certain point. It starts to get really valuable and starts to count. But it's usually protected so that the community spouse can live there and doesn't end up homeless. One car is usually exempt along with certain household items. But like I said, this is complicated and there are specific calculations and treatments for different types of assets. And it's emotionally wrenching. So you need help with this kind of stuff. I also wanted to talk about the R word, recovery, because if you receive Medicaid benefits, there's going to be a requirement for the government to recover any monies that were paid out for you when you die. And that's the whole entire amount paid to that individual. And it's always here targeting the estate of that person. I've lost count, really. I've sat across the table from dozens of spouses, most of them women who are overwhelmed when they get to this point. They're grieving. They're at the loss of a partner. And now they're expected to be financial navigators and legal strategists overnight. I hear questions like, am I going to lose my house? Do I have to divorce my husband? Is that what's going to help? I never want that. What if I live for another 20 years? How am I going to pay for that? The answer really is you don't have to do this alone. And there are ways to protect yourself, but you have to plan. And I want to talk strategy. Let's take a little breather, and then I want to talk about strategy and, strategy that's more than just a safety net. Welcome back. We are talking strategy after we've talked about all those questions, all those issues that relate to long term care. And before I talk about strategy, though, I want to ask you to do something for me. If you haven't already, would you please like the podcast? Would you subscribe? It's really important. It's helping me to reach more people. So, hey, there's an idea. Why don't you share this with a friend? So many people are affected by these issues. I thank you for doing that. That's my whole point in having the podcast, really, is to help to better understand these issues before they impact you in a negative way. Two, it's all about planning, right? Strategy. So, ideally, we want to start with planning before a crisis, right? But even if you're already facing a nursing home, it's not too late to plan. There are long-term plans and then there are things that are called crisis planning. So you can, and don't do this without someone that understands the repercussions of managing assets and Medicaid planning, okay? Please, you could create real problems for yourself. You could create an ineligibility period, a penalty period in which you have to pay money in before you can even be eligible. You could make yourself ineligible, period. And you could also face fraud charges. So this is serious. All right. So I say that, but I say that, there is some planning you can do. You can convert assets, sometimes, even exempt ones like your house. Rather than selling it, you could create income producing property, or you could convert them to assets that are acceptable, like an annuity that can pay out um, income over time. I mentioned the D word before, and divorce. I don't consider that an option, but sometimes people consider it. And then there's also spousal refusal, which means a spouse can try to refuse to contribute towards the care. That doesn't always work here because under the state law, spouses can be responsible for the other spouse's medical debt. Right? It's called the necessities clause, but it's just you're on the hook most of the time if you're a spouse and it's medical debt. And then, these things called Medicaid asset protection trusts. They're irrevocable, but you got to set them up years in advance, at least 5 years, because you got to avoid that look back and the recovery rules. Sometimes you can do some other things, but like I said, you got to walk a really careful line with this um, because it can foul up if you're not working with someone who's able to tell you where those minefields are, quite frankly. So, with that in mind, there is one more thing I wanted to talk about, and that's recovery. I touched on it before, no one wants to talk about this, but you really need to think about it. So, Medicaid asset recovery. The federal government requires it, so don't blame the state. They have to attempt to recover any dollars that are paid for long term care from the estate of the one that received it after they die. This means if your home is in the name of the spouse who received the care, it could be targeted, even if you still live in it. You got to plan. You got to be able to know how to report these things to avoid or defer some of these things. So imagine this. Your husband dies after several years in nursing home care. You live another 10 years in your family home. So when you pass away, the state files a claim against your estate. This can happen, and they take the proceeds from the sale of the house. Sometimes they can force the sale of the house, even if you're intending on giving it to your children or your heirs. And sometimes it leaves nothing or next to nothing. It feels cruel, but, it's legal. And, it just kind of makes sense. If you've got resources available to pay for your care, you should pay for it, right? Why should the government pay for it? I don't want to start that debate, but, just it makes sense. So if you don't think it makes sense, let me know why you don't think it makes sense. There's lots of reasons, including how much it costs and when that's going to ever stop, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm just talking about if you have money available, you should contribute. So, and that's why planning ahead matters so much. All states handle this recovery differently, and some have expanded recovery, which gives them more opportunities to recover. Here in Tennessee, we've got limited recovery. So that limits the state to recovering in probate. So that's got some interesting strings attached to it, but I'll talk about that in another episode. But there's also important deadlines now that TennCare has to face in terms of recovery. And suffice it to say, it just kind of depends on the notice that it receives or whether it does receive notice at all. And this is another complexity that you really need professional help with. So, as we start to wrap up, I really wanted to talk about what happens if you don't plan, right? I wanted to share two scenarios, stories really, that are fictionalized, but they're based on very real events that I see often. Okay. So this one I entitled The Tragic Surprise. So Mary's husband, George, had Parkinson's and spent about 4 years in a nursing home facility. Mary was told Medicaid would pay, and it did, which helped, right? If the care was $10,000 a month, that prevented her from having to pay that. But after he passed, the state looked at recovery. She deferred it, died 5 years later, and the family was shocked to find out that they had a $165,000 claim, priority claim, really, to the state. They had no idea. What a terrible surprise. And I'll tell you, before you can even convey real estate anymore, you need a TennCare release from a state recovery because these kind of surprises happen all the time. Title companies are going to ask for those releases. Here's my story 2 of the proactive planner. Okay. David and Linda came to see me, let's say, early, and we set up a trust for their house, and then we repositioned some of their assets. Later, David entered long-term care, but Linda stayed at home. And so there was enough time that when David passed, the house wasn't subject to estate recovery. It was in a trust, and the children inherited it. There was no lien, no recovery, no court fight, no surprises. The story's never that simple. I will just say that caveat, but it's all about planning. Planning is power. Planning is power. So, what can you do today? My objective is not to leave you feeling overwhelmed, but if you do, that's normal, okay? You're not supposed to have all the answers. Really, nobody does. But here's what you can start doing today to work towards, you know, a plan. I've got 5 practical steps that I want you to consider. And there is a downloadable checklist. Go to my website, nancycogar.com, and you'll find it there. It's free, complimentary, and you can download it. So, first, inventory your assets. I can't tell you how many people send me incomplete lists of assets. Know what you own and know how it's titled. Titling is power. Okay. You can do so many things with titling. I'm going to have a whole nother episode on the magic of titling. So talk to a qualified elder law attorney. This is definitely not do-it-yourself work. Hey, review your estate plan. Maybe you got it done 5, 10 years ago. Take a look at it, okay? Make sure you've addressed this issue. If you haven't, revise it, update it. Hey, don't wait for crisis planning when you're healthy, because when you're healthy, you have the most options. And finally, this is a really tough one. Give yourself some grace and some space. This is hard stuff. It is so very emotional. But it's, if you plan, this, in my opinion, is one of the greatest acts of love and protection you can offer to your spouse and your family. I hope you take away some good nuggets here. Let me know what you think. Didn't answer a question? Reach out. Let me know. I love getting questions, love getting comments. Hey, I saw some great comments from a recent podcast, and I love that you share that. It's just honest, right? Honest stuff. That's what I want to talk about. I want to work through the hard stuff, and I think it's going to help us. So thank you for joining me today on Boomer Time. So, and if this episode has touched a nerve, like I said, raise some questions, that's a good thing, okay? Don't leave more stressed out than when you started. Get ready to plan, to protect, preserve what matters most. And if you want more information or you want to connect with me, you want to schedule a strategy session, visit my website, nancycogar.com, okay? And that you'll find that free checklist. You'll find all kinds of resources because I love them, and you can connect to me. So, thanks a lot for being here, and I'll look forward to seeing you soon.